So hello and welcome to the fourth day of What the Dickens. Today I'm going to be talking about Barnaby Rudge. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 1. In the year 1775, there stood upon the borders of Epping Forest, at a distance of about 12 miles from London, measuring from the Standard in Cornhill, or rather from the spot or near to which the Standard used to be in days of yore, a house of public entertainment called the Maypole. Now, I read Barnaby Rudge for the first time when I was about 15 years old, and then I very recently reread it back in December. I did speak about it in my December wrap-up, so I'm going to try and focus on slightly different things here, but it was definitely a joy to reread, and I'm really glad I reread it because I didn't remember that much about it from the first time. Now, Barnaby Rudge is slightly different from the majority of Dickens' novels in that it is one of Dickens' two historical novels, the other one being Tale of Two Cities, which is set during the French Revolution. Barnaby Rudge is set partly in the year 1775 and partly in the year 1780. And Barnaby Rudge takes as its focal point these anti-Catholic riots that went on in London during the 1780s. These kind of fall at the heart of the book and what draw a lot of the characters together. But as with all Dickens novels, there are a lot of other plot elements going on in Barnaby Rudge in the meantime. The book opens in a public house called the Maypole, and a stranger appears in this tavern and is told this story of this murder that happened several years before. A man who owned this grand manor house was murdered, as was one of his employees, but the whole town is kind of haunted by the legend and the myth of this story and the kind of fear of the murder that went on at the time. Now, the murdered man left behind him a young daughter called Emma Haredale, who was brought up by her uncle, Mr. Haredale, and the murdered employee of the late Mr. Haredale was a man called Mr. Rudge, and Mr. Rudge, on his death, left behind him a widow called Mrs. Rudge and a son called Barnaby Rudge. Now, Barnaby Rudge is quite an interesting Victorian protagonist or hero in that Barnaby Rudge suffers from what today we would call severe learning difficulties. As I mentioned in my December wrap-up, the terminology used to describe people suffering from those kind of conditions in the Victorian period is quite limited and often we would consider today quite offensive. For the majority of the novel, Dickens refers to Barnaby Rudge as the idiot. This was the technical term in the Victorian period. It is not considered to be offensive then, though obviously reading it now can feel quite uncomfortable, I think, and that does make Barnaby Rudge, I think, a slightly more difficult read. However, the very fact that Dickens chooses as one of his central characters someone that has learning difficulties is very interesting, especially because there are a lot of very important characters in Barnaby Rudge, and I arguably wouldn't say that Barnaby Rudge is clearly the most important, if that makes sense. So the fact that Dickens chooses to name it after Barnaby Rudge kind of stresses his importance. A lot of the time, characters with physical or mental disabilities in Victorian literature are presented either as complete villains or as just mere victims, but Barnaby Rudge is slightly more complicated than this, which does make it a really interesting book to read. Now, the other central characters in the first half of the book include a locksmith named Mr. Varden, his wife Mrs. Varden, and their daughter Dolly Varden. We also introduced quite early on to Dolly Varden's would-be sweetheart, Joe, and Joe is the son of the man that owns the pub where the novel begins. Joe is deeply in love with Dolly, and Dolly is quite fond of Joe, but thinks she might be able to do better. She's quite vain. She thinks quite a lot of herself, and she knows that she is very pretty and could kind of have her pick of men, so she doesn't want to settle for Joe, even though she is quite fond of him. Another young man who is also desperately in love with Dolly, and kind of unpleasantly desperately in love and obsessed with Dolly, is Mr. Varden's locksmith apprentice, and this young man is called Sim Tappertit, and for the first half of the book is very, very entertaining and very silly until he becomes a little bit more sinister in the second half of the book. Now, about a third of the way through the book, we skip 5 years into the future. This is not a spoiler. The book is entitled Barnaby Rudge, with the subtitle A Tale of the Riots of 80, which refers to the year 1780. So although we start in 1775, it's clear from the beginning that we are going to end up in 1780. In the year 1780 in London, there were quite a lot of anti-Catholic riots, and the kind of focal point of Barnaby Rudge as a book is these riots. All the characters are kind of drawn together and thrown into these riots. Barnaby Rudge gets inadvertently caught up in these riots because he really doesn't understand what's going on, and the sort of central plot of the book is built from a lot of stuff that is going on in the riots, both the riots themselves and also the prominence of a highwayman who appears throughout the book here and there, and his relation to the other characters. But let's talk about what I love about Barnaby Rudge. There are a lot of things I really did enjoy about it. One of the things I think that is very strong about Barnaby Rudge is that it is very dramatic, very exciting. There is a lot of violence, there is a lot of action, possibly more action than there is in a lot of other Dickens novels, so I think that might appeal to quite a lot of people. And there are a lot of very interesting characters in Barnaby Rudge. Some of the villains especially are quite curious. One of the villains, Hugh, who is a friend of Barnaby but definitely a villain even though Barnaby is not. Mr. Chester likewise is a very hypocritical and intriguing character. I did mention this in my December wrap wrap up, but one of the things I really like about Barnaby Rudge is it explores how certain environments can really change the way people act. So the riots really affect the characterisation of quite a lot of people. A lot of characters who appear very funny in the first half of the book become quite dark and sinister in the second half of the book, when in the riots they end up behaving in sort of abominable, awful ways that are really shocking. And likewise, a lot of characters that you kind of don't like in the first half of the book and that are not very nice, they're kind of shocked by the riots and their characterisation kind of changes to something more positive. I really enjoy that. I think it's done very well. Dickens really interestingly explores how there's kind of mob mentality and also how the general fear around London and the surrounding areas at the time can affect people. I think that aspect of Barnaby Rudge is done really well. As always, Dickens is very entertaining and there are some very, very funny passages in this book, but there are also some very dark and interesting passages. It's also a really interesting book for exploring the kind of religious dynamics going on in the 18th and the 19th century. It was written quite a long time after the events that Dickens is describing, and at times there is a sort of Victorian superiority, as you will, looking back and thinking, oh look how awfully everyone was behaving then. But at the same time, it surely says something that Dickens thought it was interesting to write about this at the time, and the kind of respect that he shows for Catholics and the complete disgust that Dickens has in the intolerance of the rioters and the sheer hypocrisy of all of them is really, really interesting to look at, like, Victorian history and attitudes from that perspective as well. It probably tells you more about the Victorian perspective on the 1780s than it actually does about the 1780s, but at the same time I still find that really interesting. In terms of things I don't like as much about Barnaby Rudge, I do find that because the thing that draws all the book together is these riots, these events, there is a lot of description of mobs, and so you don't really get into the characters as much as you do in some of his other books. It's more about the events going on than it is about the people within the events. There is a lot about the crowd more than the individual, which means that some characters feel a little bit left behind. Some of the characters do feel a bit underdeveloped and they're often absent for big periods at a time. For example, although Barnaby Rudge is the title character, he is missing for quite a lot of the book. His mother also, who I thought could have been a really interesting character, seems to disappear at various points and we don't really hear as much from her as I would have quite liked to. Barnaby Rudge is Dickens's fifth novel, and alongside most of the other books from the first half of his career, I do find the presentation of women not that brilliant. There are some wonderful, brilliant, grotesque and caricatured female characters in this, especially Mrs. Varden. Likewise, the presentation of her maid, Miss Niggs, is very, very hilarious and very well done. But the characters who are supposed to be the good women are just not that interesting. Like, Mrs. Rudge could really be so much more developed, and the two younger female characters, Dolly Varden and Emma Haredale, I just don't find that convincing. Emma Haredale has the seeds within her to be a really interesting moral beacon, as some of Dickens's later women are, people like Esther Summerson, but she just isn't really that developed. And Dolly Varden, as I mentioned in my December wrap-up, I really like everything she does and everything she says, but the way Dickens describes her is quite creepy. Whenever he describes Dolly Varden, Dickens alternates between the language you would use to describe a really sexy woman and the language you would use to describe a really pretty, cute child, and it's quite creepy to the point that it is quite uncomfortable reading. And Dickens does do this occasionally. There is a tendency in quite a lot of Victorian literature for beautiful women to be described as little in a way that becomes just quite creepy and a bit kind of infantilizing. It's not very nice. It's not one of the nicer aspects of Victorian literature, but it's really, really common, and Dickens does it quite a lot, especially in the first half of his literature, but also sometimes later. Even as his female characters become more interesting, he still does fall into this Victorian trope quite a lot. So for me, although there are many things that I really enjoy about Barnaby Rudge and I find it a very exciting and interesting book to read, I do feel that the plot doesn't hang together quite as much as some of Dickens's other novels, and the presentation of his female characters isn't wonderful. Saying that, there are a lot of very interesting male characters. I mentioned already Hugh, and I think Jo Varden is lovely. There are some really beautiful, wonderful bits in Barnaby Rudge. I am very fond of it and it was a real pleasure to reread it. I think the riot scenes are really interestingly written, and the presentation of Barnaby Rudge, as I said, although it doesn't always make for the most comfortable reading, it is very interesting in terms of looking at Victorian attitudes towards people who had those kind of mental disabilities. I wouldn't recommend it as a good starting place. I really do enjoy it and I think it's a very dramatic and engaging book, but I think because it doesn't have a central character in the way that some other Dickens books do to tie all the rest of the characters together, even though it's called Barnaby Rudge, I think that would make a difficult place to start with. So I am very fond of it, but I have my reservations, as with many of the Dickens books in this first week. I hope you still all believe that Dickens is my favourite author, by the way. I have such love for Dickens. I also I'm aware that he is problematic at times, and I would never want to pretend that is not the case. His books are intensely problematic, but also intensely brilliant. I'll be back tomorrow when I'll be talking about another Dickens book.